Mary and Elizabeth. This time of year, it must feel a little bit like Christmas in July to hear that passage. See, that's when we typically remember these pregnancies and we talk about this passage. Yet, I've noticed that in this passage in particular, but many others, women in history and women in the Bible get identified by their relationship to others. Women find their roles defined that way back then and sometimes now. Whose husband, or who is your husband, who is your child, where are you relationally to others? You can see, however, that this passage has other things to give us besides these women as mothers of babies, wives of husbands. Can we see these women for who they are as individuals? Not only someone's mama or someone's wife. Who are they as themselves? Who are they in this miraculous story of the Incarnation? Who are these women? Well, let us find out. This passage is commonly known as the Visitation. It's the meeting between Mary and her cousin Elizabeth. Mary went to the hill country of Judea right away to see her cousin, as soon as she found out that she was going to have the Messiah. Now this is about 75 or 85 miles from Nazareth, where she had lived, to the southern Judean hillside. It would take Mary 3 or 4 days to get there. Now this is where Elizabeth lived with her husband, Zechariah, except for the 2 weeks of the year that he was serving in the temple. Remember, he was a temple priest. This was easy walking distance to and from Jerusalem when they were at their home for Mary, or for Elizabeth and Zechariah. Their home was in a town called En-Karam, a tranquil place of trees and vineyards, which it still is. There's a picture of En-Karam on the front of your bulletin, and I was very particular on which picture to choose, because En-Karam has a couple of parts. It has this valley home of Elizabeth and Zechariah, where there's a big church over it. This was their town home. But it also has a vineyard up on the top of the hill, which was very special. That's where I'll kind of be setting the rest of this story. Where I took that picture, I am standing almost to Elizabeth's vineyard, and I'm looking over on the hillside that, to be real honest, looks very much like the one I'm standing on, but I couldn't take it at myself. And so they were similar hillsides with En-Karam in the valley. What you see, that building there, is one of the convents in the area. So these are the hillsides, the hill country of Judea. This is where Mary goes to meet Elizabeth. And I'd like to draw in these pictures because what I hope you've noticed over these last few weeks of Israel stories is the varied landscape that is in Israel. If you had presumed that it was all desert, or all mountains, or all lush valleys, or all vineyards, it isn't all anything. And so each of these stories are set in a particular place and a particular geography. This is the hill country of Judea. So it is now a town of Jewish artisans and craftspeople with Christian churches and with convents, and it is a beautiful, peaceful town. I think that this is one of the areas where I just felt the most calm and peace. You know that feeling that we have when, maybe just the musicians are out playing and it's that nice, cool night and you're strolling with nowhere to be? That's the feeling I had in En-Karam. It was just beautiful and peaceful. So when you go into En-Karam, you encounter the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth. And the tradition does teach that they have these 2 houses. So though their usual residence was in the valley, it was much cooler on the house located high on the hillside, so they escaped the heat and humidity of the warmer months by going up to the vineyard. However, I referred to this earlier as Elizabeth's vineyard. There's a reason for that. It is believed that this was her dowry, and so the house was hers, the vineyards were hers, and certainly they were going to pass to her children, but it was her family's property, so this was where Elizabeth went and liked to be. It is believed that when Elizabeth found out she was pregnant, and remember she was older, 80s, 90s, when she found out she was pregnant, that she went up for 5 months into seclusion up in that vineyard. that's where she waited, because if she had walked around at 80 or 90 and announced, I'm pregnant, she would have been put in the funny farm. So instead, she waited until she was showing before she came back down into the valley, where things were quite obvious. So 5 months she spends up in the vineyard. And Mary came to visit her there. Elizabeth had been married to a priest, and so Elizabeth is established, and she's secure, and she's known to be righteous, and she's living blamelessly according to commandments. Mary, on the other hand, is unwed and surprisingly pregnant, and she is socially the opposite of Elizabeth. They come from different ends of the age spectrum and different status, yet they are surprisingly in this moment of sameness. This miraculous, surprising, unconventional pregnancy for both of them. Elizabeth's old age makes it too late for a child, and Mary, in her circumstances, finds that it's too soon, at least in her life, for a child. She's probably between 14 and 17, somewhere in there, which wasn't too young at the time. Don't get me started. But it was inappropriate that the baby had come, shall we say, early compared to marriage. So when the angel announces that Elizabeth is also expecting a non-typical pregnancy, Mary is invited to go there for support. And it doesn't take her long to figure out she should be heading up to the vineyard. We aren't told how long it's been since their last visit, yet Mary went there and she greeted Elizabeth. Now, greeting Elizabeth was a very specific term because it was a bit of a ritual or a ceremony of a social event. A traditional greeting was going to involve hours of conversation, an embrace, physical affection, talking about how life had been for all of them, food, that kind of thing. When you come and formally greet someone, stay for a while. It's going to be a process. But they had an awful lot to talk about after all. So surely they would have both talked about the visits they received from the same angel, Gabriel. And if you can imagine that conversation, you too, an angel? Can you imagine them both yelling out, Gabriel, right at the same time? I mean, the scripture seems so detached when you just read the passage, but if you go in there in your mind and you sit at that tea table with these two women, what would they say? How would they say it? What would you say if it was your friend? That it's that real. It's that alive. I think Mary went to see Elizabeth because she knew Elizabeth would believe her. Frankly, there was only one woman on earth who could identify with Mary's story, and that was Elizabeth. Elizabeth is the only person who would have had any rational reason to believe what she said was actually the truth. Telling Elizabeth made sense. Then Elizabeth could be a support for her when she told everybody else. If Mary had told anybody else, they would think that she was making up this preposterous story about Gabriel and being the mother of the Son of God. No one else was going to believe that. Again, it was going to be, oh, you're trying to hide this indiscreet pregnancy. But Elizabeth knew better. She was in the trenches too. So Mary and Elizabeth leaned on each other and supported each other in friendship. Elizabeth strengthens and encourages Mary. Mary inspires Elizabeth because they both need each other. God gives Mary and Elizabeth community and connection in the presence of one another. And Mary and Elizabeth see the world around them and the world to come more clearly and more fully when they are together than they are as individuals. They get the bigger picture. Can you imagine how seen and heard these women must have been just by spending time together? Someone who understands the road that they are walking. This is something about having a unique life experience in common that connects people. And for these women, it's validating what they saw and heard in a way that no one else could. This is the gift of presence. Not presence under the tree, presence, being present in someone's life. This is a precious, precious gift. A few years ago, I listened a lot to Brene Brown, a social worker and author. If you ever encounter her work, listen to it, read it, it's fabulous. And Brene Brown talks about how to interact with people in a healthy way and human relationships. And she said one day that she went into her daughter's room, and her daughter was about a middle schooler, and she was crying about something in the day, sitting in the dark, and she said that everything in her wanted to turn on the light and tell her how to solve her problems. But instead she realized in that moment that it wasn't her job to turn on the light and explain everything to her daughter. It was her job to just sit in the darkness with her. That's the gift of presence. You don't have to solve anyone's problems. You don't have to change the world. You don't have to turn on the lights. You just don't let someone be alone when they're there. You're just present. That's all we're called to. Not knowing the answers, not solving the problem, just being present. And see, that's what Elizabeth and Mary were for each other. Sure, they had a common road, all the better to validate each other, but they were present for one another in a way that no one else could be. So coming off of this trip there in Israel, the second flight that I took, the one from Newark to Chicago, I happened to be in a 2-seat row. And I was sitting next to a man there, and he got up and walked up and down the aisles a bit, was coming back, and he flipped his book over on the seat next to me. And I saw something and it said St. Augustine Press. Now I remember from seminary, St. Augustine Press is 1 religious, 2 Catholic, and 3 very intellectually deep. Whatever is coming from St. Augustine Press, get out a highlighter and pack a lunch, it's going to be a while. So I thought, who is this man sitting next to me reading St. Augustine Press work, something written by that publisher, on a leisurely flight? So he came back and sat down, and I kind of mentioned, what's that? And we talked a bit, and I said, I was just in Israel this morning. And we spoke for a bit, and he is actually a Catholic seminary professor who was going to Chicago to speak at a national conference for Catholic professors and leaders and teachers. And as we spoke, he said, so what shocked you about this trip, if it's your second trip? He had never been. What surprised you this time? And I said, you know what surprised me? This trip, I fell in love with Mary. Now, by the way, this is the right answer to give to a Catholic theologian. No one was going to accept that answer like he did. And in fact, if it had been a Protestant friend sitting next to me, they might have looked at me strangely. But he was ready for this conversation. Because there was something about standing in that vineyard where Elizabeth welcomed Mary. That place where these 2 women supported each other, almost in seclusion, at their hardest times. A place where friendship blossomed, and they dug in together to what was going to be a religious pilgrimage for both of them that meant something to me on this trip. It happened that the trip, though it was small, ended up being my co-pastor, who was a male, and his best friend for like 40 years, male, and everyone else on the trip was female. And so I found that not only was I taking an interesting leadership position because the females seeking spiritual guidance were leaning for a female pastor. So I found a leadership I didn't expect I was going to encounter there, but also we ended up with a group friendship that I didn't expect. One that still has phone calls coming from California from someone I didn't know before I went on this trip, and one where we keep up and support one another. And somehow that blossomed and bloomed in the garden of Elizabeth's vineyard, where she and Mary met. That was precious and moving to me, because it was mirroring what happened on that land before. And when I stood there and I thought about Mary and Elizabeth standing in that space, somehow they became real. Their humanity, their vulnerability, their need for one another. It somehow was so real and so parallel with my moments in a different way. It was a special place to be. And I wanted to come back with this message that in good times and bad, we need our friends. We need our friends to share our lives with. Friendship was kind of the hallmark of my trip to Israel. There were amazing sights, there were spiritual awakenings, but the friendships that were made a huge difference. Friendship matters. Some of us have a strong and abundant family around us, and some of us don't. Some of us used to have kids at home, or a spouse at home, or someone close to us, a parent living with us, and some of us don't. Friendships are so important. We have to lean on each other. We have to be present for one another. We have to look out for each other and support one another. This requires vulnerability. It requires honesty. It requires being brave and calling someone up and scheduling lunch. Being proactive, it matters. Whether you're the one that has someone in your house or whether you're the one that doesn't, reach out. It matters. Summertime is a great time to connect with a friend, one that you haven't spoken to in a while, or a new friend that you would like to make, whether from church or from town, from a place that you're part of a group in. It's a good time to connect. I was recently talking to other pastors of this congregation about the connections made when these churches merged between Lansing and Harbor Springs. I went to a training, and there I was with Vaughn and Mary Sweet, and there was about a dozen of us in that room, and I wanted to go in and say, if you have a pastor, Harbor Springs UMC, raise your hand, because it was a third of us. So when I talked to them, I said, you know what was beautiful to me watching? What was beautiful to me when the Lansing congregation came over and merged with Harbor is the friendships that I was waiting to see blossom. I sat there and thought, and yes, we talked about it, Mary and Vaughn and I said, this person from Lansing is going to really like this person from Harbor. This person from Lansing loves this stuff and is just waiting for someone else that loves this stuff, and I know someone at Harbor. So I did sit back feeling like matchmaker. Right? I sat back and I watched and I would see how you guys would discover each other, and I'm like, yes, go Holy Spirit. And now seeing some of the fruit of that has been amazing. And talking to Vaughn and to Mary Sweet about that, they were absolutely saying, yes, I can see that. They have common interests, common outlooks. What a blessing it would be to have newer and deeper friendships, not just in ministry, but in life. I think that we're seeing the roots of that starting already. See, there's a blessing in walking together, sharing life. A blessing found in open doors and open lives, knowing that you can stop by, knowing that you can pick up the phone. I've got to say, my generation has done some great things, and we've done some things not so great. I would say that we haven't been so good about this one. I watched my grandparents' generation have neighbors just stop by. My grandmother and the neighbor across the street got one newspaper subscription together because Grandma was going to buy the paper and he was going to come by and read it with a cup of coffee the next morning, and it was their routine. They were both widowed, and they just checked in with one another once a day. She had the paper, he brought the coffee. And this was how life was. They would check in with one another, drop by, and always have time for each other. My generation doesn't do that well. We do well filling up our calendar, and we do well getting busy and frazzled, but we don't do well in sitting in the presence of one another. And I think, though none of you are my grandparents' generation, you're maybe a generation or two below that, removed from that. I think that you all do that better than our generation does. Mine. Do it. Enjoy it. Live into it. Stop by one another, pick up the phone, and share life together. Because this visitation story with Mary and Elizabeth invites us to recall how much we need one another. To draw fresh courage from one another, to celebrate all our joys together, and to confirm the promise of God in one another that we see beautiful gifts in each other. God gives us friends to keep each other company, to exchange wisdom, and to support and encourage each other. Friendship is such a beautiful gift from God. Therefore, church, may we both give and receive the gift of friendship. This isn't a hard lesson, but it's an important one. Go and live it out. Amen.